Welcome to the Westcliff podcast. This is the kickoff of our spring series where we'll be exploring revolutionary ideas and rethinking life, creativity, and humanity itself through raw, unfiltered conversations with some of the boldest thinkers on the planet. Together, we'll confront questions most people are afraid to ask and imagine futures most people can't even see coming. For instance, today we'll welcome Max Moore, who will ask, what if destiny isn't a destination, but actually a choice? Derek Sivers, we'll be talking to him in March, who will ask, what if success means doing everything backward? Audrey DeGray will be asking, what if aging is just a disease and actually it's curable? Natalie Pace will be asking, what if everything you've ever been taught about money is a lie? And Kirby Ferguson will be asking, what if originality doesn't exist and never did? We'll get to our guest, Dr. Max Moore, in a second. But first, I want to introduce Westcliff University to members of our podcast audience who might not be familiar with the 32-year-old institution. I'm Dr. Barry Sandrew, Director of Entrepreneurship at Westcliff University, and your host. Pictured here is our campus in Irvine, California. Westcliff is an accredited private institution of higher learning with over 7,000 students enrolled both live, online, and on campus. There are 5 colleges: the College of Business, the College of Education, the College of Law, the College of Technology and Engineering, and this summer we'll be welcoming in the first class of our College of Nursing. We also offer a full stack coding bootcamp certificate and a cybersecurity bootcamp certificate. To learn more about Westcliff, including our awesome undergraduate athletic program, I invite you to visit our website at westcliff.edu, as well as Westcliff University on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, X, formerly known as Twitter, YouTube, and the Little Red Book. Before we begin, it's important to mention that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the host or Westcliff University. And now for our guest. Today I have the privilege of speaking with a man who spent his career challenging our deepest assumptions about life, death, and the future of human potential. Dr. Max Moore is a philosopher, a futurist, and entrepreneur, best known for pioneering the modern transhumanist movement and shaping the philosophy of extropy as opposed to entropy. Extropy is an optimistic framework for continuous human progress and augmentation. As a thought leader in biostasis and cryonics, Max has dedicated decades to exploring how we can and perhaps should transcend biological limitations. His work doesn't ask what if. It demands we take seriously the idea that death, as we define it today, is a moving target, one that science and technology may one day render obsolete. His latest book, now in its final stages, is a definitive exploration of biostasis, examining the history, science, and philosophy behind cryonics. It's a subject that has long been misunderstood, and one that under Max's guidance is finally receiving the rigorous intellectual defense it deserves. Max has debated skeptics, confronted misconceptions, and remained steadfast in his belief that the boundaries of human capability are meant to be expanded, not accepted. Today, we'll explore the real-world implications of transhumanism, the challenges and breakthroughs in cryonics, and what the future may hold for those who refuse to accept their biological limits. Max, welcome to the Westcliff University podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
You wrote Transhumanism Toward a Futurist Philosophy in 1990, which became a foundational text. How do you define transhumanism today, and how has your perspective evolved since 1990?
The basic definition of transhumanism hasn't really changed in those 35 years, and I still find it amazing that much time has gone by. Essentially, transhumanism I define as a class of philosophies of life that seek continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and limitations by means of science and technology guided by life-affirming values. So that core idea remains, and it also remains, I think a useful way of explaining it is to look at the term and break it up a little bit. So transhumanism we can break up in two different ways, trans-humanism and transhuman-ism. Now the transhuman-ism emphasizes the part that's going beyond the human. That's basically rewriting our genetic code, modifying the brain, so going beyond human limits. But the trans-humanism aspect of that emphasizes its continuity with humanist thought. So the humanists, of course, didn't necessarily take a view on whether there was a higher being or not. They said whether or not there is a God up there, it's up to us to make our life good, to improve the world, to improve ourselves. And the means of doing that was essentially reason, able to the only humans have, as far as we know. Maybe somewhere else in the universe, but not here. So that's what was special to us. And that's very much all a part of transhumanism. But the humanists, of course, being humanists, think that the human condition is it. That's the limit. We have to deal with that. Whereas transhumanists are saying, well, hold on a minute. We're developing all these new technologies and sciences. We're changing the external world. Why should we not change the internal world? For instance, why shouldn't we be able to change ourselves so that we don't age and die just like other animals? Why shouldn't we upgrade our ability to think, our emotions, and so on? So it's really a challenge to the fundamental constitution of what it is to be human, while maintaining those core features that the humanists champion.
So it's an extension of humanism, or it is something other than an extension of humanism?
I think of it as, humanism is a philosophy of life, and so is transhumanism, and they have a lot in common. So it is building on it. There's not, humanism can take different versions as well, so I wouldn't want to say it's the same as any particular version. But again, those core principles of humanism are still true in transhumanism. Now, people, of course, challenge various aspects of Enlightenment humanism and said, well, reason doesn't really work, or there is no real truth behind. I don't actually agree with any of those changes. I think humanism is still on pretty good grounds with rationality, even though it's much more complicated to figure out what is rational these days. So it is an extension of humanism, going beyond that to not just question past practices like authoritarianism. Humanists wanted democracy, getting rid of slavery. It's going beyond that and actually questioning the fundamental limits of what it is to be human.
Technology is an essential ingredient, or is it not?
Transhumanists don't rely on any specific technology. The truth of the philosophy, or the value of the philosophy, is independent of any particular technology. It's also independent of any particular timeline for the development of a technology, because transhumanism is about a direction, it's about values and goals and where we're going. Any technologies that can help us get there, if wisely used, are part of this. Now, clearly, there are certain technologies which are certainly these days more or less central to this. A big one, of course, is artificial intelligence, something we've been talking about for a long time, and well before it really became into popular consciousness these days. That seems like a very powerful technology for doing research. Well, I don't think current systems are actually. I think they're quite limited in terms of scientific research, but in the future, I hope they will become better and better at that and start actually breaking the code of aging and so on. Another technology that I think will be very important in the future is molecular nanotechnology. So basically, how to rewire matter programming in a sense. So if we're going to build huge structures in space, we're going to have AI, nanorobotics, and advanced robotics too. So no particular technology it's tied to, but if we never develop AI or nanotechnology or more advanced molecular biology tools, we're never going to fix the aging problem. So in that sense, it clearly does depend on technology.
Would that include genetic engineering, the editing of genes?
Yeah, and that, of course, is something which today isn't that much of a big deal. Back in the 80s and 90s, and I guess maybe into the early 2000s, a lot of people had a sort of visceral bad reaction to that. And under President Bush, we had the President's Council on Bioethics with Leon Kass and Francis Fukuyama very much against any kind of genetic engineering. But now we've heard of some interesting breakthroughs in England, people with 3 parents, modifying genes, pre-implantation diagnosis, just the beginnings of things now which are widely accepted. And I think just like in vitro fertilization in the early days was considered something kind of abominable and interfering with God's plan, and you produced zombies. Today, nobody would take that seriously. It's a very widely accepted practice. So I think in the same way, genetic engineering will be. And of course, we have to distinguish between 2 kinds of genetic engineering. The somatic engineering, which just makes changes in one generation. And then we have germline engineering, which will make changes that will be passed down through generations. That's probably one that worries people a little bit more. But there are ways of dealing with that. For instance, you can put in genes that won't be activated until someone actually chooses to turn them on, which I think is quite a sensible way of doing things.
I think that some of the the issues surrounding genetic engineering had to do with the idea of creating a super race or something of that nature. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, that's kind of the old eugenics idea, and eugenics, of course, has some bad connotations. But if you look at the actual word, what does it actually mean? It means you, good, and genics, basically your life, is good biology. So there's nothing inherently bad about that. Every time, mothers who eat well and give, while they're pregnant are essentially doing eugenics, right? They're trying to produce healthy babies. So the idea that eugenics is kind of a bad thing is really based on the idea of it being used by a single central power to enforce their version of what they think humans should be. And that's not good, and that's not transhumanism at all, and that's something I have to emphasize. Transhumanism is about individual choice. And in fact, I emphasize the principle of morphological freedom, which says the individual gets to choose how to use these technologies. It's not for a government to come along and say, we want more of this kind of person, or people who are more obedient, or people with these skills. That is not at all the goal. That would be a misuse of these technologies.
What are the most common misconception about transhumanism? I know you've been pretty much in this battle for decades now, and it has been a battle. What you produced in 1990 was pretty. It was out there, and it was really groundbreaking stuff. And I know that there was both a positive and negative reaction to it. What is the most common misconception about transhumanism today that you find correcting?
Oh goodness, there are several of them really. One that I have to keep pointing out: people often talk about us wanting to perfect ourselves or perfect the body. And if you look through my writings, you won't find the word perfect except to criticize it. I don't like the word perfect or perfection. It's kind of a platonic ideal that doesn't really describe the real physical world. So it's not about perfection. That also is a very static state, right? If you're perfect, there's nowhere else to go. Whereas certainly my sort of extropian version of transhumanism, it's all about perpetual progress, ever improving. So there is no perfection. There's no final state. Plus, of course, there is no one form of perfection. My form of perfection might be very different from yours. So that's a big mistake to identify transhumanism as about perfection. Another big one is to say that it's about immortality. This one really bothers me because I have to do this every day. I'm fighting this one, especially journalists who love to pop in the word forever and immortal and so on. But immortality is not a goal. The goal really for transhumanism is to make aging and death optional. You get to choose how long you live, other than, of course, from accidents and murder and homicides, that kind of thing, which will still kill you. You're not invulnerable. So it's not about making everybody live forever because maybe they don't want to. It's about giving people that choice. That's an important one. It's also not, and this one we can discuss a little further later on perhaps, it's also not about the idea of a singularity. That's a very popular idea these days, that technological progress driven by computer technology will keep accelerating as things get faster and faster, and that will keep driving change more rapidly. There's different versions of the singularity. But I don't necessarily agree with the singularity perspective, and we can discuss that a little further. I think that technology accelerates and then slows down, accelerates and slows down, accelerates in some areas and not others. So I don't necessarily think there's going to be some kind of single super fast point where suddenly everything drastically changes or the machines take over. So it doesn't require that kind of view. It's also not about predictions. So for instance, Ray Kurzweil is quite famous for his predictions, and he's got apparently a fairly good rate of getting things fairly right. But it's not about predictions. It doesn't stand or fall on the truth of predictions. It's about a direction that we're pushing in, not about when exactly things will happen. And I've become very skeptical actually about trying to make any kind of forecast because we're just really bad at it beyond a very few years. So also another thing that comes up is somehow this idea that transhumanists hate their bodies and want to get rid of them. That is a strange thing for me, particularly because I'm very hard working on my body. At 61 years old, I'm in pretty good shape and I take care of myself. I like my body and try to maintain it. So somehow the idea that we want to improve our bodies gets mistranslated into we dislike or loathe our bodies for some reason. That's not at all true. They seem to be trying to pin on us kind of an old, very early first century kind of Christianity, sort of the hatred of the body and the whipping of the flesh. It's not at all like that at all. Wanting to improve something doesn't mean you hate what you have already. It's also not long-termism. That's another idea that's come about recently. Long-termism is essentially the idea that we should weight the needs and desires of people in the distant future just as heavily as we do ours today. So because there are far more people in the future than there are today, that basically means you don't get to do anything for yourself or your current generation. You've got to constantly calculate what you should do to benefit future generations, which I don't think is even possible. So it's also not long-termism. So one way of defining what transhumanism is by pointing out what it's not.
It's interesting you talk about singularity and how it's not. I mean, when you first started out, it seemed to me, reading your initial essay, that you were promoting a singularity-like trajectory, but now you changed that to, as you stated, more of a self-constrained modular model. What led to that shift? Was it because of, is it because of pushback? Is it because of realization that society may not want to support a singularity model?
So if you look at the people who promote the singularity, they tend to be, computer scientists and engineers. They like mathematicians, and they have this very nice, clean exponential curve, right, which we're going to slide our way up. And the problem is, very early on in my intellectual history, I learned economics and also social psychology, two things that interested me a great deal. And so I talked about this with Ray Kurzweil way back, like in 2001, where he came to speak at our conference. And this was a few years before The Singularity is Near came out. I argued with him back then. I said, Ray, just look at these nice curves. You're not allowing for things like human psychology, organizational imperatives. You can introduce new technologies into an organization. It doesn't mean they're going to get used very well. A classic example of that is the enterprise resource management software, very expensive, sophisticated software, or customer relationship management software, which was introduced starting in the 80s. And economists for 20 years were discussing the IT paradox. Where's all the productivity? So we put this new technology in, which is supposed to be really helpful, but we're not seeing it in productivity. And in fact, it took quite a long time, almost a quarter of a century, before we started seeing the results of that. So you can't necessarily plug a technology and expect things to change rapidly. Another example I would give is, you're right, by the way, 25, 30 years ago, I was much more of a singularitarian. I was expecting pretty much a takeoff. So things have changed. So another example I would give is in the 90s, as we decoded the human genome, we thought that medicine would take off very rapidly. There'd be a whole bunch of new, more effective drugs. What happened after 2000? The number of new drugs actually slowed down as they got more and more expensive thanks to regulation and other problems. So the singularity idea to me doesn't take into account organizational blockages, human psychology that can slow down adoption. It doesn't take into account regulation. There's a lot of factors like that can slow things down. So I do think that certain technologies, and obviously AI right now is a good example of this, can take off very rapidly. I mean, it's crazy right now. Every week, there's so many new developments happening. But I know a lot of people are projecting that that's going to go on for the next 100 years. It won't. I guarantee it won't. It'll slow down. Some other technology will take off. I actually think that the current AI models will reach some severe limitations because they just don't have the right capability to do deeply original thinking. I hope to be proven wrong, but I think that's going to be the case. So it's really a matter of looking beyond science and technology to other factors and realizing that this kind of idea of basically infinite acceleration doesn't really reflect reality.
You've been a proponent on life extension through the use of bionics, or what you're calling biostasis. Could you explain that a bit?
Core goal of transhumanists basically is to not die. We want to keep living in good health, obviously not in declining health. That's not the goal. But progress in that area has been very minor, basically none at all. If you talk about extending maximum lifespan. So, the French woman, Mrs. Calment, is still the world record holder of 122 years or so. And nobody's beaten that. That was, 1997? So despite all these claims of wonderful breakthroughs and exciting things happening, maximum lifespan has not budged at all. So I found it a little bit depressing. At 61, when I was 25, 30, I thought we'd have made much better progress. Another reason for skepticism about singularity claims. So what do? Well, you try to stay healthy, right? Because the longer you can stay healthy and not die, the longer you have to take advantage of any new real breakthroughs. And I think they will come. I just don't know when. But because we don't know when, what I call longevity plan A is biostasis or cryonics. These are not exactly the same terms. People are more familiar with cryonics, human cryopreservation. But biostasis is a bit of a broader concept that includes that. It could also include other kinds of preservation, for instance, chemical preservation or combinations of cryo and chemical preservation. So the idea here is that you may not make it to a point where we've beaten the aging problem. That doesn't mean you should give up. What we can do is at the point of legal death or clinical death today, which is not the same as true death, that's something we could discuss some more. We can take you, we can slow down your metabolism as rapidly as possible. We can protect the cells against freezing damage, and then plunge you down to an extremely cold temperature, minus 320 Fahrenheit, minus 196 Celsius. And at that point, nothing is changing. And we can store you for as long as it takes, whether it's 50 years, a century, or longer. And that gives technology time to catch up until we hopefully will reach a point where we can repair the damage done by the aging process, by the cryopreservation process, rejuvenate the body and bring you back out in good health and allow you to carry on living to the point where we no longer have the problem of aging. So that's kind of a huge motivation for me to make sure that biostasis cryonics work as well as possible, because I want to make sure my brain is not damaged and that I actually have a shot at the future, because the odds that I'm going to make it till we figure out aging is not looking too great at this point.
As a neuroscientist, I would have a natural skepticism towards all of this, but I know that rat kidneys have been frozen and have been thawed out, that lack is a better word, and have been functioning normally. Isn't that true?
Yeah, it's actually many tissues. So organs are more impressive, but just to back up a little bit, people say, well, you can't possibly do this because everybody knows when you freeze things, the cells will burst, the ice will expand and the cells will burst, which is just not true. doesn't look like getting repeated all the time. What actually happens is that if you don't cryoprotect the cells, as if you don't introduce a solution to replace the water, ice will form between the cells, not inside them, and will put pressure on the cells, do some damage that way. But the main damage is actually done by the dehydration of the cells. So the water leaves from inside the cells, goes to the outside, and that shrinks the cells and concentrates the solutes. And that's what causes damage. But you can stop that. First of all, that doesn't destroy the cells. Cells have an ability to be somewhat flexible. But if we do cryoprotection, which is what is done in cryonics, essentially we replace the blood, as much body fluid as possible, with a cryoprotectant solution. You can then go to cryogenic temperatures with minimal or no ice formation. And we know this works because there are people walking around today, millions of people walking around today who are cryopreserved as embryos. So we can preserve eggs, sperm, embryos, heart valves, corneas, skin. There are many, many tissues we can cryopreserve and reversibly. Now, getting to organs, of course, gets more complex because you have to rewarm at a certain rate. You have to rewarm quite rapidly. Otherwise, it sounds weird, but ice will actually form as you warm up, or recrystallization. And you want to avoid that, so you have to warm very rapidly. Now, with tissue slices, that's pretty easy, but when you get to an organ, especially a mammalian organ like a rabbit or rat kidney, it's more tricky. But in recent years, there have been several successes. In fact, the University of Minnesota recently did this kind of repeatedly with rat kidneys. So we're kind of moving up the scale from single tissues to organs. And of course, we just made a bunch of different organs, and the brain is an organ. So there's actually some evidence that the brain is easier to cryopreserve without damage than some other tissues. So to me, that says that we can, even today, with current technology, if we get to a patient quick enough and do a decent job, and based on the evidence we have from CT scans and electron microscope scans, we are preserving memory and personality in the brain. So then it's just a matter of the speculation, well, can we ever reverse that? And it's easy to say, well, I can't imagine how, so it's impossible. But of course, people couldn't imagine spaceflight very well in the 19th century. They certainly couldn't describe how it's going to happen, but you could have pointed out to them back then that it doesn't violate any laws of physics, and nor does this. So it's really just a matter of extrapolating our repair capabilities in medical nanotechnology. And if there's no other alternative, I'd rather go into the cryogenic duo than to be burnt or buried. At least it gives me a chance.
The alternative is cremation, and it's like when I buy a lottery ticket, people ask me why, and I said, well, because if I didn't, because if I do, I have an infinitely better chance of winning than if I don't buy one. And same way, if I go into cremation, obviously, I have no chance of recovering.
Other forms of dying, and I use dying in today's sense, especially clinical death, some of those leave you very much intact. For instance, cancer is in some ways a pretty good way to go for a cryolysis because you have a lot of warning. It's a gradual decline over time, and you could be there in the hospital ready, have the team standing by. Whereas if you die of a heart attack or a stroke or an aneurysm, that's generally pretty bad because it can come out of the blue, and it might take some time for a team to get to you. But we've had a lot of experience. There are hundreds of cases now, probably around 600 patients, and we know that so long as we get to you within a certain period of time, we can still do a fairly good job. I mean, the quicker we get it, the better. But even after hours at room temperature, people think the brain will dissolve. It actually hasn't. It takes quite a while for the brain to dissolve. It's a gradual process. It's not a switch that suddenly gets turned off. That's a big misconception that, dead is dead. That's not the case at all. As you can see by looking back through history, and in my book, actually, I have a whole chapter on the history of resuscitation medicine. And it's kind of funny what they used to do in the old days, but they tried to revive people. They would put them on horseback and bounce them up and down to restart the heart. They used bellows to pump into the lungs. And they tried stuff, and some of it actually did work occasionally. The bellows occasionally worked. But now, since the 60s, we've gotten pretty good at that with defibrillation and birth strokes and actually therapeutic cooling. They actually use that because you can prevent brain damage. We have the cases of human beings who have been clinically dead for an hour or longer who are returned pretty much intact. Now, these are usually cases of people who've fallen into freezing cold water. And its most famous case is probably Anna Wagenholm in Sweden. So there's no breathing, no respiration, nothing happening for over an hour, and yet she was revived intact. So, we know that death isn't this thing that just happens and it's too late. It's really a matter of degree. And the whole point of biostasis is we're saying, let's stop the dying process, let's pause it, and let science catch up and help the person in the future.
You've had a couple of euthanasia patients as well, but in that regard, you've also biopreserved your dog, which was the ultimate cryopreservation, correct?
Yeah, we had a dog, Oscar. I didn't really like dogs until we got Oscar, but my wife insisted, and I'm glad she did because we both fell in love with him. He lived to about 15, which is quite remarkable for a large dog. But we didn't want to let him go, so he is cryopreserved at Alcor. We have 2 other dogs already following this path. So hopefully when we come back, we'll have our pets waiting for us.
Yeah, you can't let a golden doodle die, right?
No. And actually, this raises the point, though, that a lot of people talk about this as if you're going to come back all on your own in the future, which would be quite a daunting prospect. I would still want to do it. I mean, I left England and came to California. Things were pretty different. Nobody didn't know anybody. You get used to things, especially if that's your personality and you're a bit of an adventurer. But it's not really going to be like that. I already know many dozens of people who've either been cryopreserved already or will be, and of course my pets and my family. So I think if you bring other people along with you, friends and family, you're not going to be alone. And that's, in some ways, that's more important than the technical arguments. People can accept that technically this probably is workable, but most people are too terrified of the idea of going into an unknown alien future with out-of-date skills, no family and friends. So it's very important to address those issues, which I'm doing in the book by talking about the rehabilitation process. I think you're not going to be revived and kind of thrown out the door. I think just like people emerging from long-term comas today, they're going to help you get started again. So it won't be as difficult as people imagine, I think. Not going to be easy necessarily.
There's some talk about whether it's best to preserve an entire body or just the brain. And if, in fact, you're talking about future advancements that will cure disease, seems to me rather than having to deal with the whole ecosystem of the entire body and all of the symbiotic relationships between organs, if you're just dealing with the brain and you could actually simulate or reproduce all of the sensory systems in a far superior way, that would probably be the way to go. Isn't it the most efficient way of handling something like that? If you're taking the risk that the technology is going to advance so far that you're going to be able to bring an entire body back, wouldn't it be more efficient and better if you're just focusing on the brain?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think there's really a definitive answer to it. So people make a choice, and about half people that Alcor, which I used to run for quite a while, but half the people there arranged to have the whole body preserved, and the other half just the brain. I've always been a brain-only guy myself, but I'm thinking I might switch to whole body. And the reason being is that it's basically kind of a bit of insurance. You don't really lose anything by taking the whole body. If they decide in the future that you're not going to regenerate it, we're just going to grow you a new one, or maybe a robot body, or upload you, or whatever, you still have the option, though, if that's not the case, you still have the whole body. So I think it's probably a good idea to take it with you. There are some reasons why brain only could be advantageous, at least in certain places, like in the United States. In some states, there are rules. This is getting to be less of a problem actually over time, but there are some states where if you are legally dead on late Friday afternoon, you have to get a transit permit from the health department, and they don't really stay open on weekends, so you may be stuck there till the next Monday. This is getting better because there are now online systems, and you generally get around that. But that was a big problem in California for a while, and in Florida. So if you're a brain only, if you do the separation there, it's considered a tissue sample, basically, a tissue donation, and you don't have to have the same transit permit. So that's kind of one reason why. But then that's not really against whole body. That's really against doing them together. You can still actually bring the rest of the body separately later and store it. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. And if we can't reconnect the spinal column, then we're not going to do much bigger things like reversing aging and so on. So I think conservatively take the whole body. But another reason why people might resist what you're suggesting, Barry, is that It is just you might come back as an emulation or an upload or something. But for some people, that would not be survival, and this causes a big philosophical question: would you be the same individual if you're no longer biological? So that makes it it's already hard enough to sort of sell the idea that this is a good idea without also requiring that people make that big philosophical assumption. So it's kind of a matter of choice. Let's leave it to people. They can even specify in their paperwork, I prefer to come back uploaded or come back in a virtual reality, and maybe that will be acted on. But I wouldn't close off other options in case those aren't in evidence.
There's a philosophical paradox called the ship of Theseus, which basically is you've got a shipwreck and you start to replace all of the parts of the ship until all of it's been replaced. Is that the same ship? Is that how would that relate to what we're talking about in terms of? Well, I know that 90% of our bodies are replaced in over 12 years. I think only the brain, the lenses of our eyes, and the heart is only 1% gets replaced. Everything else is replaced. So we're really not the same person 12 years out.
But basically, what I think is identity, what makes you the same individual over time, is psychological connectedness and continuity. So there's a certain degree of, the person I am today is very similar to the person I was yesterday, and that's very similar to the person the day before. Of course, you could disrupt that. I could walk out there and get hit by a car, have brain damage, and my personality could totally change. We've seen cases like that. And I think in that case, the body is alive, but I might say, well, it's not the same person anymore. They've gone. There's the famous case of Phineas Gage. I'm sure you've heard of this one. A guy, I think 19th century, who accidentally fired a bolt through his head, went right through his corpus callosum. It didn't kill him, amazingly, but his personality radically changed, and nobody recognized him afterwards. So in some sense, I would say he hasn't really survived. I'm not sure about the memories there. So physical continuity of the stuff you're made of, to me, isn't important. And in fact, even with the brain today, we're starting to be able to replace biological neurons with synthetic ones. So very early on, even they've been working on this for decades now. But for instance, someone has a damage to their motor cortex. Before too long, we were to plug in synthetic neurons, which can also mimic the neurons around them and replace that function. As long as it's doing the same job, I think that doesn't really matter. So the ship of Theseus, though, is slightly different because there you're ending up with two individuals, right? So you've got the ship, you take out one plank at a time, use that to build a new ship, and you replace the old plank with a new one. You end up with two ships that look the same. One of them is made with the original material, but it's also discontinuous. The other one has always been in the same spot, just replacing it bit by bit. So then you've got a difficult question. And philosophically, I think you have to say, because of logical identity, those two later ships before you started doing that are not the same logically as the first one, but who cares? I'm very much kind of on Derek Parfit's side, the philosopher who presented this view. It's not really identity that matters, it's survival, continuity. So if I become, let's say I'm cryopreserved, and rather than repairing this body and brain, they decide to create a whole new version, and for some reason there's an accident and they make two of me, I don't think that I'm dead because there's no identity continuity, no individual identity. I think I've survived in two people. That's the way I look at it. So it's not really the stuff I made up. It's not even being single that necessarily matters. It's the psychological continuity into the future.
In the past, you've described religious dogma as a system that kind of mitigates progress in transhumanism. In this regard, you've used the metaphor, I remember this from your essay, of religious people kneeling, able to look up, but they can't move forward. Do you still see religion as fundamentally at odds with transhumanism?
So just to give a little background on this. So when I was first developing ideas about transhumanism, I was a pretty militant atheist. I went through a lot of different religions early on. From when I was actually like 12 or 13, I started exploring a lot of different religions. Christianity, reincarnation. I joined the Rosicrucians for a while. I studied the Kabbalah. I did a lot of different things. And by the time I was about 15, I started figuring, well, none of this really makes sense. I can't really believe any of this. But towards the end, it's hard to remember exactly the chronology, but at some point I really did believe in hell. I thought hell was a real place where if you didn't believe, and my brothers pushed this idea on me, if you didn't believe that Jesus is literally God, you're going to go to hell forever. You're going to be tortured forever. That is a horrible, horrible, evil idea. And even though I knew that was wrong, I couldn't quite shake that from my head. And so that was strongly associated with religion to me, which of course isn't fair to all religions. And so it made me very angry about religion. That's just a horrible thing to do to people. It's a horrible method of control. But over time, I kind of chilled out and realized, well, religion isn't all bad. It's obviously done some good things. It helps with social cohesion. Yes, it can help with control in some bad ways, but it can also keep people together. It has community. Actually, a lot of evidence suggesting that having community is important for longevity, and religious people tend to have more community. It's kind of hard to replace it. So there are valuable things about that. The problem with religion to me is that, in some sense, on one level, it's fundamentally incompatible with transhumanism, in my view, because the essential part of transhumanism is rationality. And to me, religion, if we're really going to talk about religion as religion, what is this? A system of faith and worship. Faith is by its nature not rational. I know that some theologians try to argue, especially Catholics, that you can have the two together and they somehow come together exactly. I don't buy that at all. I think they're very different means of thinking. Now, of course, in reality, things aren't that simple, because a lot of atheists aren't necessarily particularly rational. They may think in ways that are actually quite faith-based, not willing to question their assumptions. They may even have certain authorities they treat kind of like the Bible or religious authority. And many religious people are very rational in many areas of life. So, I don't want to be so harsh on religion these days. Sometimes people say, well, isn't transhumanism a religion? Well, no, it's not, because it doesn't involve any faith or worship. There's no one you're worshiping. There's no sort of central dogma like that.
Transhumanism does rely on faith to a certain extent, a faith that technology is going to actually make it real.
I would disagree with that. One thing I wrote back in, it was 1994, was a piece on pancritical rationalism. Essentially, it's taking critical rationalism to the limit, arguing basically that you don't need to take anything as given. Now, in a lot of philosophy, a lot of epistemology throughout the centuries, people have looked for certainty. They've tried to ground knowledge on something that can't be refuted. So, of course, Descartes famously decided that he questioned everything that something he couldn't question, his own existence. I think that's right out, which is probably incorrect, by the way. Other people have argued that what he could really conclude is there are thoughts. What is this? What is this I? But that's a good example of trying to start with something irrefutable and building foundations on that. Others, empiricists and rationalists, look for ideas that couldn't be refuted, or axioms that you have to assume by refuting them. It's very tempting to try and build knowledge on absolute certain foundations. I don't think that's necessary at all. I think with critical rationalism, you can hold everything open to question, including rationality and the scientific method itself. But as long as it keeps working well, there's good reasons to keep using it.
You and I discussed the Mormons have a transhumanist organization, I believe, or a conference or something like that. So somehow they've been able to reconcile transhumanism with their religion. If a religious leader fully wanted to embrace transhumanism and they didn't have a salvation endpoint, like Catholicism, what theological framework do you think they'd need to adopt?
The ones are not generally transhumanists. I don't think most of them have heard of it, but there is a quite active group of Mormon transhumanists, and they do argue that there's no real incompatibility. And in fact, in that religion, it's probably a lot more clearly compatible, because they don't really have a god. They have, you can actually become a god and have your own planet if you do a good enough job. There's more like a hierarchy of gods. So it's not like there's us down here and God up there, and never can we get together. So it's, in some sense, probably more open to this kind of idea of human self-improvement. It's interesting how religion can really adapt. Catholicism is an obvious example that did not like the idea that we're not the center of the universe, but eventually formally adopted that, and formally adopted evolution. So it can change over time, which is puzzling, because it was supposed to be a complete and absolute truth, but yet somehow they managed to change that truth. So I think what will happen is, if you have something, for instance, like radical life extension, if that becomes a real thing that we've proven, we know it's there, religions are not going to oppose that for very long, even if they do initially, because it'll be just too popular. They're going to reach some accommodation. And I like to mention, there's a short story by Mark Stigler called The Gentle Seduction, which I really enjoyed this story. It's about this guy who's kind of like me, who has this view of the future, looks forward to it, but he dies early on and doesn't get cryopreserved for whatever reason. His girlfriend isn't really into these ideas, but she enjoys her life. But bit by bit, she becomes much more than human. She's hiking in the mountains and sees a group who managed to avoid the ice crumbling away because they have infrared vision. And then she realizes hiking is getting tough because her bones are not doing so well. So she takes a little nano pill that rebuilds her spine. And bit by bit, she becomes more than human and into actually making contact with the alien race with this gigantic mind. I think that's kind of what will happen. We just gradually adopt these things bit by bit. Even things like the AI stuff we're using today, it's really quite new, but people are treating this like, oh, why doesn't this work better? Why can't I do this right? We don't go, oh, this is mind blowing. We go, oh, how can it be better? So I think we actually can adapt very well, and I think religions can adapt too. I don't think it will probably require massive changes in doctrines. That they'll just be backing off and saying, okay, I guess that's the Bible doesn't mention a lot of things, so maybe it's okay.
So you don't have any fear of AI at all in terms of the human condition. You don't think it's going to more or less take over?
I don't think so. I think there's a lot of fear. People seem to be addicted to fear, always afraid of some end of the world for one reason or another. And that's actually, talking about how transhumanism has developed. Some branches of it have kind of headed in that direction. We've become obsessed with so-called existential risks, how the world might end, and I think overly emphasizing those. I mean, obviously, every technology has a danger. I think currently the biggest danger is not AI; it's nuclear weapons. The same as it's been for decades, and that just depends on obviously international relations. I'm not saying that AI couldn't be dangerous, but most of the arguments why it's going to destroy us seem to be utterly unconvincing and require sort of really stretching things to make up bizarre stories. It seems to always end up with a single AI that's in total control, whereas I think a much more plausible scenario is we'll have multiple AIs, which will have different people behind them, different interests, will essentially be competing with each other. So as long as no single AI has total control, and we keep humans in the loop, I don't really worry about that too much. But the point is really, to me, we can't really stop it. What we have to do is surf the waves of change. Keep our eyes open as we're developing these technologies, put in reasonable precautions, but we can't really stop it, because if we stop, other countries like China are going to do it anyway, and maybe less carefully. So it's a little pointless worrying excessively about destroying humanity. But actually, what it can do is save humanity. It can save billions of lives. People who are currently dying early throughout a lot of the world, people who are poor. It can make a tremendous difference in that. It can help us solve the aging problem. So it could actually save billions of lives. So let's not forget that. And that's what I call existential opportunity, to counterbalance existential risk.
In April, we're going to, I'm going to have Aubrey de Grey on as well. And I know you know each other, and I know you probably debated each other or discussed transhumanism together. I know he doesn't really consider himself a transhumanist, but how do you differentiate between what you do and what he's doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are people who don't call themselves transhumanists who I think necessarily are. So, for instance, Ray Kurzweil, although I disagree with him on some of the singularity stuff, his view of things is clearly transhumanist, but he doesn't like to use the term. And I understand some reasons why people don't. Aubrey, I don't think understands transhumanism. He's not really he's not a philosopher. He's focused specifically on anti-aging, and I don't think from my discussions with him, I don't think he understands the idea that well. So he may be or may not be. I'm not really sure. We haven't really talked about that, but certainly, he's working on the area that right now is one of the most central things, apart from trying to build AI tools that might accelerate biological research. Actually doing that anti-aging research is probably the single most important thing right now, because if we don't live, then we don't get to enjoy any of the other things.
Actually, I listened to an organization, a podcast, I think it was Stringency recently, was an international event that you spoke at, where they had an MD that was also doing psionics, and he had a very big operation. How many companies are actually doing this?
Not very many. It's been disappointingly slow in terms of growth. When I was first involved, starting in 1986, I started the first organization in England actually back then. There were very, very few people, though, maybe a couple hundred people on the planet doing this. And it's still pretty small. It's just numbering in the thousands, the number of people who actually made arrangements for this. But it is growing. And what you mentioned is probably Tomorrow Biostasis in Europe. It must be Emil who's on with me. He started an organization just a few years ago, which is growing very rapidly. I think it's already up to 800 members, which is more than half that Alcor has after 52 years or so. So that's looking quite promising. How fast it will continue growing is pretty hard to say. It's one of those things that, is it going to be more like getting doctors to wash their hands, which took a long time, but even now is a bit of an issue. People who didn't believe for a long time that there were such things as germs, they thought it was a ridiculous idea, so they didn't bother washing their hands. Is it going to be like that, taking a long time, or would it be something like anesthesia, which was adopted very rapidly for obvious reasons? Everybody had an incentive for anesthesia. The person experiencing the pain, having their limb cut off, obviously want something. The doctor who has to hold them down doesn't want them to feel pain either. So there's a strong incentive there. I think there's actually a lot of obstacles to widespread adoption of biostasis. It makes you think about death very directly. You can confront your own death, which is very uncomfortable. And you have to make very practical plans about it. And it doesn't offer any certainty. It's very uncertain. I'm not guaranteeing this will work at all. I think it's highly likely the technology will be developed. It's not certain. And there's no certainty that any one particular person's cryopreservation will go well. All kinds of things can happen. So that's not a very easy sell, right? It's not probably if we were dishonest and said, well, I guarantee we'll revive you in 2082 and you'll be just great. And I was very certain about that. We'd probably get more people. It's just not the way it is. So it may reach a tipping point, though, whether it's a technical breakthrough that we can say reversibly cryopreserve a small animal, or we can demonstrate that you can train neural tissue to do something, cryopreserve it, and then show that it retains that function after being revived. It might be that. It might be some well-known person behind it. I don't know. But at some point, it might suddenly take off. But it doesn't really need to. I think she's writing something about this for the book right now. It'd be a very different world if the government got strongly involved, not necessarily better. But organizations are actually designed, and have been around for decades, to survive for the long term, even if they're quite small. So as I said, two of the organizations, Alcor and Cryonics Institute, have both been around for around half a century now and still manage to work. And the way the funding works is they have basically trust funds that cannot be spent on anything other than maintaining and eventually reviving the patients. So there's a lot of thinking going on to making these organizations resilient and able to survive regardless of how popular their idea is.
Your life partner, Natasha Moore, hopefully I'm looking forward to hopefully having her in our fall season join us. She wrote the Transhumanist Manifesto in 1983, and it's gone through 4 iterations, and Puritan is fascinating. She's also, I've heard her speak many, many times, and she talks about the bad actors in this area and how that needs to be, people have to be aware of that. Should there be some sort of regulations, governmental or international regulations on cryonics?
I don't think they're necessary. It doesn't need specific regulation. There are plenty of laws already. There are some laws that would be helpful. You mentioned earlier on euthanasia. It's actually really more a case of death with dignity. Euthanasia is considered more of an active intervention. But that is pretty helpful. There are now several states in this country where you can actually schedule your cryopreservation. So long as 2 doctors agree that you have no more than 6 months, you can decide that you want to go earlier, which is very good for actually being cryopreserved very well, because you can call up an organization and say, how about doing this 10 days from now? And they can have a team standing by, and there'll be 0 delay. There's no worry about logistical problems or delays. So that kind of, there's not really a regulation. That's just a law that makes that a lot easier. Because also be good to have laws that give cryonics patients some kind of legal status, so they're not considered just biological samples that you could in principle dispose of. They'd have some kind of rights. And of course, there'll be laws also needing to be addressed in terms of if we do revive you in the future, what about your previous property to get those back? If you remarried, what happens there? When there's some issues like that, which will require some laws to be made. But in terms of having a regulatory agency, no, we really don't need that, because this almost happened actually a few decades ago when the cemetery board tried to regulate cryonics. And that would have just been kind of disastrous, because it's a totally different thing, right? When you're burying somebody, you're burning them to be buried, there's no great hurry. Whereas this is a medical procedure, it requires very rapid response. So I don't think it needs any specific kind of regulation, just application of existing laws, making sure that organizations are honest, they do what they say. I don't think it requires a regulatory body, which tends to bring a lot of unnecessary rules, increased costs, and slowing down innovation.
So basically, just an oversight type thing to make sure that this type of thing is up and up.
The current organization, Biostasis Technologies, one of the things we're very focused on is essentially creating industry standards. So, especially if you have industry standards, you don't really need outsiders imposing that view of what works. So we know what works, and we know what kind of standards there are. And some organizations won't be up to those standards. It'd be nice if we had some kind of certification where we could say, no, these guys aren't publishing their finances properly, or they're not doing a good job with this. We're not going to give them the stamp of approval. So that kind of thing, if you want to call that regulation, I'm in favor of that kind of regulation. It's kind of like a consumer reports for biostasis, I guess. I'm certainly in favor of that.
Yeah, and you've got, and yours is a nonprofit as well.
Pretty much all the major cryonics organizations are non-profit, although you can split up the different functions. So in principle, you could have a membership organization that kind of arranges people get some arrangements going. That wouldn't really matter so much if it was profit or non-profit. The most important part, though, is the storage organization, because that has to last for who knows how long, decades, maybe a century, maybe more, we don't know. And I've written a couple of articles on this where there's a lot of research. It's pretty clear the organizations that can really endure are non-profit organizations. Obviously, religious organizations, the Vatican's been around for a long time. Universities, there are some universities that are half a millennium old. So they tend to be non-profit structures with some interesting counter examples, mostly from Japan. There's a lot of family-owned businesses that have also gone on for many centuries. I think the record from Japan was 1,400 years, an organization that was finally absorbed by someone else. So those, they can really plan long-term. They don't have to worry about paying back shareholders in the short term. They can really focus on the long term. So that's storage organizations tend to be oriented that way. So nobody's getting rich from this. Nobody's able to sell their shares or get a super high salary. There's a lot of misconceptions about that.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure it's been very informative to our podcast audience. I want to thank you again. And like I said, I'm looking forward to hopefully having Natasha on in the fall. Thank you very much.
She's been involved in this as long as I have, yeah. So it's you're right to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank our guest, Max Moore, for fascinating discussion. I want to thank our podcast audience for being here and for listening to this incredibly important topic. You'll all be receiving an email. In that email, you'll have a questionnaire that we'd love for you to fill out. It helps us really refine and improve our podcasts in the future. Please take the time to fill that questionnaire out. You'll also receive information about how to learn more about Max Moore and how to learn more about transhumanism. Before I announce our next speaker in March, I want to tell you a little bit about purposefulbuying.org. It's entirely managed by our smart capstone students. The platform sells Nepalese products, with all proceeds going to Pahar Trust, a 30-year-old charity that's building schools in many of the most remote villages in Nepal. Check out purposefulbuying.org. Our next speaker in March is Derek Sivers. He's a master of unconventional wisdom, a musician turned entrepreneur who built a $22 million business by breaking all the rules, and then he gave it all away. He's known for turning simple ideas into profound life lessons, making you question everything you thought you knew about success, creativity, and living with purpose. In my upcoming interview with Derek, we'll explore why success isn't about doing more, but actually about doing less. But doing less differently. Get ready to rethink your assumptions about business, creativity, and the art of living simply. Thank you again, and goodbye.